Hi, welcome back to Fireside Chats. I'm Samantha Harris, and today we are going to be talking about FIRE's 2018 Speech Code report, which we just released today. And in this report, which we've published every year for the past 10 years, we talk about speech codes on campus, whether they're going up or down, interesting trends. The news this year, as it has been for many years, is mixed. The number of schools that maintain what we call our most restrictive red light speech codes has continued to go down for the 10th year in a row. But at the same time, the percentage of schools that maintain some kind of speech code is still over 90%, which is obviously far too high. At the same time, we've seen an increasing number of schools get rid of all their speech codes altogether and earn what we call a green light rating. So the first time we put out our report, there were 8 green light schools. Now there were 35 as of the time the report came out, 37 as of today. So that's really great news. But what I really like about the report is that it gives us an opportunity to tie the work of all of our different departments together, because FIRE's grown a lot over the years. We have a lot going on. So what I wanted to do today, instead of just talking about the speech code report, was bring on some of our experts from different areas of FIRE's work to talk about how speech codes and the work we do researching speech codes impact their work. One of the very common types of speech codes we see on campus, about 1 in 9 of the schools we surveyed has them, is called a free speech zone. And this is where a school will restrict students' expressive activities to either small or out-of-the-way areas of campus. And actually, this year in California, FIRE filed a lawsuit challenging one of those free speech zones. So I have here Brynne, an attorney from our litigation department, to talk to us a little bit about that case. So Brynne, tell us about the case in California.
So this is a case in California that we filed this year. And what happened in this case was the student who is a student at Pierce College in Los Angeles, Kevin Shaw, was outside last year, so November of 2016, and he was with 2 field representatives from Young Americans for Liberty, and they wanted to hand out Spanish language copies of the Constitution outside on a public walkway at Pierce. And so they set up their folding table, and a college administrator came up to them and told them that they couldn't do that and they needed to be in the free speech zone. And Kevin asked what would happen, and he was told he could be removed from campus, or he would, if he didn't fill out a permit application and go in the free speech zone. So he had to go inside and fill out this permit just to hand out copies of the Constitution.
Now, this was, by the way, not the first time that students have been stopped for handing out constitutions on campus, right? This has already happened, and it hasn't worked out well for the schools that have tried to do it.
It's also not the first time in California. Modesto Junior College was one of the early adopters of that practice.
So I don't have a copy of the Constitution on me to show you what he was handing out, but I'm sure you can all imagine, little tiny pocket Constitution. But I do have a copy of the Pierce College map with me, and you probably can't see the free speech zone. It's really hard for me to see it without my reading glasses on. It's like this tiny little area right there. And when you do the math, it's about 0.003% of the main campus area. So it's a really tiny area. And
which means most of the campus then is a censorship zone, right?
Right, and what's really crazy is if the whole campus was the size of a tennis court, that little tiny free speech area would be the size of like your standard iPhone. So that means so just picture that.
The iPhone 8 or the iPhone 10? Or is that an iPhone X?
I think like it was an iPhone 7 at the time, but we're talking about really small area of campus. Where you can actually engage your students, your fellow students, on the issues that you care about, which is really sad because you should be able to discuss the issues that you care about with your fellow students, your friends, anywhere on your campus, on a public college campus.
So how did we get connected with Kevin, and what's going on with the case?
So right now we're waiting for a decision in the case. The school filed a motion to dismiss, and the briefing's complete, and we're just waiting to find out what the judge thinks, and then we'll see where it goes from there. But I mean, I think that it's really horrible that we see and hear about examples of students being restricted to these free speech zones. Every week we hear about, almost every week at least, we hear about a new student being told they have to speak inside of a free speech zone, regardless of what they want to speak about.
Well, the one thing that's really interesting to me about the Spotlight report is that when we know that 1 in 9 schools use free speech zones to restrict speech, that also tells us that 8 in 9 don't, and the sky hasn't fallen there.
Right.
So
Yeah.
it's a real tough case for institutions to make that they need to quarantine speech in this way in order to have the institutions run smoothly. It just doesn't hold water.
I totally agree with you, and I think what's remarkable in these, especially in this instance, is Kevin was not being disruptive. He wasn't blocking anybody. He just wanted to talk about his beliefs. He wanted to hand out copies of the Constitution, and so we're not talking about anything that has any ability to disrupt the campus. We're literally talking about one or two people. In many of these cases, handing out pamphlets like you'd see anywhere else.
I don't know. The
Right.
Privileges and Immunities Clause can be really disruptive.
And now the courts are not the only branch of our government to be addressing speech codes this year. And so I have also brought to join us, you've already met him, our Legislative and Policy Director, Joe Cohn, who's going to tell us a little bit about what some state legislatures are doing to try to protect students' free speech rights on campus. So we've seen some developments this year, right?
Well, thanks for having me, Sam. There has been a lot of development in legislatures across the country this year on campus free speech. One of the best successes was in Tennessee, where a really comprehensive bill was passed by the Tennessee legislature on bipartisan votes to eliminate those free speech zones and also to lock in the Supreme Court's definition of peer-on-peer harassment, which is really important because overbroad definitions of harassment are the most common form of campus censorship.
Right, yeah. A lot of the speech codes covered in our report are harassment codes, and we've seen this year everything from professors getting brought up on harassment charges for things that were on their exams, to schools trying to define sort of any offensive conduct of any kind as harassment. So this Supreme Court definition, which requires speech to be severe and pervasive and objectively offensive, that's a really critical element to me, because when you don't have that a requirement that it be objectively offensive, then basically anything that subjectively offends anyone can be subject to punishment. And that has a really terrible chilling effect on free speech.
Well, the Davis standard, which is what's called because the Supreme Court case that set forth the standard was called Davis versus Monroe County Board of Education, has been really helpful for a long time in making sure that schools could take action against the kind of conduct that should be prohibited without stepping on the toes of free speech to do so. And we're turning to legislatures to ask them to codify that definition because too many schools are ignoring it. So it was really great to see Tennessee take the lead there. They also had provisions that protected professors and student organizations from discrimination in the distribution of fees. A lot of good stuff in the Tennessee bill. We also saw success in other states, though, too. Colorado and Utah both passed bills to eliminate free speech zones, modeled after a bill that we wrote at FIRE, the Campus Free Expression Act, CAFE. We're really proud of that and hope that continues to drive that 1 in 9 number down. And we're turning to a lot of other states to ask them to do the same. And just recently, the Education and Workforce Committee in Congress introduced its first draft of the Higher Education Reauthorization Act. They're calling it the PROSPER Act this time. And it includes...
Well, Congress loves those acronyms, don't they?
Hey, a clever acronym goes a long way. But the bill has sections dealing with campus free speech. It has sections dealing with campus due process, and it has sections dealing with student organizations' rights too. So it's going to be an interesting few months as that bill proceeds through Congress, and we'll see where it takes us.
Well, speaking of Congress, I know you have a train to catch to D.C., so I'm going to let you go, and I'm going to bring on some other experts to join us here. Because one of my favorite things for taking the time.
Thanks for joining us, Joe.
So one of my favorite things, as I mentioned earlier, about the speech code, about doing the speech code report, is that it allows us to really tie speech codes, which are written policies restricting free speech, to the actual kinds of censorship that students face on campus. Because a lot of times, when we write about written policies, people will say, well, why does this matter? Isn't what matters how my college actually deals with free speech in practice? But the reality is that a lot of times we see speech codes used to censor protected speech on campus. And we have an entire arm of FIRE, it's called our Individual Rights Defense Program, that's dedicated to helping students and faculty who are facing censorship. So I've asked Sarah McLaughlin, who's a senior staff member in our Individual Rights Defense Program, to join us to talk about some of the cases we've seen this year that relate to the kinds of speech codes that we talk about in the report. Hi, Sarah.
Hello.
Thanks for coming. So, one of the kinds of speech codes that we write about in the report are policies that ban profane or vulgar language on campus. And now this kind of policy is unconstitutional. There was a Supreme Court decision, Cohn v. California, where a Vietnam War protester wore a jacket into the county courthouse. Am I allowed to swear on this thing? Or okay, so he wore a jacket during the Vietnam War into a courthouse with the back emblazoned with "Fuck the draft," and he was arrested under a California law and charged. And the Supreme Court ruled that charging him for wearing that jacket violated his First Amendment right to free speech, and that profanity as such, taken alone, is not constitutionally unprotected. And the famous line from that case, "One man's vulgarity is another's lyric," is one that we quote here often, in favor of the right to free speech. So this year, there was a really interesting case at the University of New Hampshire, which is a public university, at which a student was censored under a ban on profane and vulgar language for not only protected speech, but really important speech from a societal standpoint. Can you tell us a little bit about that case?
Sure. So in March, a student decided that she wanted to bring attention to sexual harassment and catcalling. So
and I think it was Sexual Harassment Awareness Month or something, right?
Yeah,
I think
it was. And so she worked with a campus group to kind of talk to students and ask them what kind of comments they'd heard, what had been shouted at them on campus that made them uncomfortable. And so they created this large poster where they had students, offer things that had been yelled at them, like "let me buy you a drink" and various much worse things.
So these were real quotes that students themselves had to contend with on campus.
Yes. And so they just wanted to bring attention to just things they had heard. And, under their policy, they weren't allowed to do it. So they put up this poster, and then the school removed it, citing the policy banning hate speech and vulgar or profane language.
Wow. And what ended up happening?
We wrote to the school and we let them know that, they can't do that. And this policy was actually harming students' ability to speak out about important issues.
Yeah, and the University of New Hampshire, by the way, is not the first time that they have been in trouble with the First Amendment. They're also pretty famous around FIRE for many years ago, having disciplined a student for posting a flyer in his dorm that led to him being kicked out of the residence hall and having to live out of his car for several weeks. So again, public school bound by the Constitution. And I think, as Brynne will attest, public universities, if they violate students' First Amendment rights, can find themselves in a little bit of trouble with the courts.
Yeah, I think that might be an understatement. I think they can find themselves in a lot of trouble with the courts. After all, First Amendment does apply to public colleges.
So the other case I wanted Sarah to talk about, another very common type of policy we see, is policies that are trying to regulate threats on campus, but that go too far. So true threats, actual threats of violence that would put a reasonable person in fear for their physical safety. Now, that's not protected speech. But what we see a lot on campus is that schools go well beyond that legal definition and use bans on threats to censor a whole variety of protected speech. And we had a case this year at Linfield College. Where's Linfield?
I don't remember.
Okay. That's a private college, so it's not bound by the First Amendment per se, but it does promise its students the right to free speech. They invited a speaker, and then they ended up canceling that speech under the threats policy for very, very dubious reasons. Can you tell us a little bit about that case?
Sure. So last April, Young Americans for Liberty invited Jordan Peterson, he's a Canadian professor, to speak on campus. And, shortly before that, Peterson tweeted, "I'm violating more safe spaces soon, Linfield College." And, obviously that phrase just means I'm introducing controversial ideas to people who I think will not appreciate them.
Right, because he's been sort of an outspoken critic of a lot of the things that we address on campus.
Mm-hmm. And, so the school took that and ran with it and said that it was clearly an intent to, it was conveying a threat to harm the community.
I know when I think of true threats, I think of Canadian psychology professors.
Violating safe spaces.
Exactly.
Yes. In that case, we wrote to Linfield and, we asked them, we were like, if he said that he was going to blow some minds, would you call in a bomb squad? Clearly, this is not a true threat, and you know that.
Right. So again, this is just one of many examples of schools using policies on threats to address things that are unequivocally not threats. And that really speaks to the kind of two kinds of speech codes we see. And I think Brynne can probably attest that this is a distinction we draw in the law too. Some of the speech codes we see explicitly ban protected speech on their face, right? Regardless of how they're interpreted. Others might look okay on their face. They might speak to threats, but then when they're applied on campus, they are applied in a way that violates free speech. And either of those is not acceptable, right, from a constitutional standpoint.
Correct. And I think that's exactly right. We see that all the time, where we'll see some policies that just on their face never can exist. Other policies where, it's going to depend on how they're applied. And unfortunately, all too often we see them applied in ways that really censor constitutionally protected speech.
There are other types of policies we address that really sort of fall into a middle ground. One thing we've really seen a rise in recent years is what we call bias reporting policies or bias reporting teams. And this is where schools they won't explicitly ban speech. Now, some do, and that's a different story. Those are just straight up speech codes. But in a lot of situations, these bias reporting policies encourage students to report any instances of offensive or biased speech to the administration, and they often don't really specify exactly what the administration's response is going to be, but they set up this whole big sort of bureaucratic apparatus. And that really sets up what we call a chilling effect on free speech, which is where even if something's not explicitly banned, this sort of vague threat of investigation and possible punishment will lead students to self-censor. And this phenomenon has really grown over the years to the point where last year we actually wrote a report on it for the first time. And I have the author of that report, Adam Steinbaugh, with us today to talk a little bit about bias reporting teams, how prevalent they are, and what some of the problems with them are. So hi, Adam. Thanks
Hello.
for joining us. So tell us a little bit about what prompted you to do this report and what you found.
I just kind of stumbled across some bias reporting systems and was interested in learning how it was or how they were actually deployed. So I have an interest in using public records requests to examine how policies are enforced. So I began issuing public records requests to universities with bias response teams saying, hey, show me what was actually reported and tell me how you responded to it. Because a lot of the bias reporting systems that I've encountered have a definition of bias which explicitly says our definition includes speech that is protected by the First Amendment. And it can be troubling if a university says, hey, tell us about all these instances of protected speech and we're going to respond to them. How they respond matters, because the First Amendment is not limited to prohibiting the government from arresting you or throwing you in jail, and it doesn't just limit the ability of a university to impose sanctions on you. Any action that a university takes in retaliation to protected speech that is intended to and has a chilling effect might be sufficient for a First Amendment claim. So when a university's bias response team says, well, we just want to have an educational conversation with students who say something offensive, and that speech is protected, well, their intent is to get them to not say that offensive thing in the future. So that might set up a First Amendment claim because they're trying to have a chilling effect. I wanted to see how universities were responding, who was on these bias response teams,
Right.
and
That was a particularly
yes.
interesting finding in terms of the chilling effect. So what did you find in terms of the makeup of these bias response teams?
Well, I found that about 60% have administrators who are housed within the student conduct division of the administration. So that sets up complaints to be, students submitting protected speech or instances of protected speech to the people responsible for punishing them. Worse, just north of 40% actually involve police officers. So you have police looking at political speech, protected speech, or speech that just might be offensive, but not political.
So we're literal speech
Literal
police.
speech police. And to a certain extent, that makes sense because they've set up these broad definitions that encompass both unprotected conduct, which might be criminal in nature, so harassment or assault, that sort of thing,
Right.
but also protected speech.
Right.
And you might want to have a police officer there to look at reports of unprotected conduct,
Right.
to offer services
But when you,
or to
when you
respond to
sweep
it.
in all that protected conduct. So that's really interesting. And one thing we found in this year's report is that upwards of 50% of private schools that we surveyed have these kind of bias reporting teams. They're pretty common at public schools as well, but we found particularly at private schools. Do you have any examples of some of the craziest things that were reported?
It's all over the place, and it is not, bound by the ideological spectrum at all.
Right.
You have students in support of Trump who are reported for writing "Build the Wall" in chalk, and you have students who are opposed to Trump who are reported because when they say that Trump supporters are racist, that is apparently hate speech, and they're asking the university to make them stop saying that.
And this sort of goes back to what we were talking about before with the problem with allowing the subjective reaction of the listener to dictate what is and isn't permissible, because people have such varied sensitivities that if the standard is, if it offends you, we can take action, then you're going to have, everything from the mildest to the most extreme from across the spectrum being reported, just because everybody's sensibilities are so different. So, I want to just circle back a little bit to this report and to where we get all this data. So every year we actually survey the data at this year it was 461 colleges and universities, mostly public because of the First Amendment issues at play, but also at a selection of about 100 of the top private colleges and universities. And we look at how much their policies restrict free speech. And we've actually got a whole database on our website. If the stuff you're hearing here interests you and you want to go to our website and check it out, our Spotlight database is where we house all of this information. We've got all of the speech code information. We've got information on all of our cases. We've got our reports like the speech code report and the bias reporting team report. And we actually also have a brand new feature that allows people to contact their administrations about these problems on campus. And so I want to introduce the developer of that new advocacy portal to come tell us a little bit about it in case you would like to get involved.
Hey.
So this is Tim Murphy, and he is going to tell us about the new advocacy portal that we have for our Spotlight database.
Thanks for having me, Sam. A lot of our supporters have been hitting us up, and they want to know what they can do. They're upset about these speech codes. They're upset about IRDP cases. And so we have this new feature in the Spotlight database that allows you to send a message directly to the administrators of your school and ask them to change those policies. The really cool thing about this portal is it allows you to send a pre-written letter that's written by us, or you can customize it with your own experience and add your class here and really add a personal touch to the letter. And to use it, you'd just navigate to thefire.org/spotlight, look up a school, and on the school's page there's a big red button that says Take Action, and that will reveal a form that'll allow you to send the email.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there. We all have a lot to do today with this report coming out. Hopefully, you enjoyed this edition of Fireside Chats, and we will see you next time.